attachment between an infant and a caregiver. We see the process of attachment in every culture. One of the values of evolutionary psychology is it makes predictions about what might the outcome be when things go wrong. And it actually gave rise to an adjacent field called evolutionary psychiatry. So when an infant forms an insecure attachment to a parent figure, the extreme case being neglect or abuse, it often results in personality disorders later in adulthood.
We don't need an evolutionary account to know this. We have all of the empirical data to hand to tell us what is required to support the developing young.
So we see attachment at work in humans between a mother or a father and their baby, but we also see it in apes, in chimpanzees, we see it in monkeys, we see it in dogs and cats. It's that kind of cross-species observation that raises the question, is this an evolved form of behavior? And what would happen with a very dependent infant if they didn't have that attachment? They'd be highly vulnerable to predators, for example. So the attachment system keeps an immature offspring close to its parent and makes the parent be very vigilant. Where is my baby, and is my baby safe? But we see that across so many species that it raises the question, has this evolved? So it's not just about the empirical data we could collect, it's where did this come from? And I think that's just one example. We could also use the example of language, and I think, Keith, you started off with the example of human language. And in Steve Pinker's book, The Language Instinct, one of the observations is that in every culture, children learn to speak. Other animals don't seem to learn to speak, but in the human species, language seems to develop, and we see sort of potentially universal milestones in how it develops. But of course, in every specific culture, children learn to speak different languages. So we see the interplay between something that looks strongly biological and the result of evolution. It's only our species, across the 600-odd language groups that exist, that shows language, and yet lots of cultural specificity. We need to hear the specific inputs of Danish or Finnish or English or Welsh in order to prime the system to learn that particular language. I think maybe this debate is in danger of reintroducing the nature-nurture question. Clearly we see a bit of nature in allowing the language system to develop, and we see plenty of nurture in shaping the specifics of the language that the child learns or the individual learns, and these two things interact.
Sure.
I mean, if you have something to say, Subrena.
Sure. So to the point of, if we look across different, particularly disparate cultures, and we see certain common themes in terms of how human beings behave, the claim is that this might suggest that there is something over and above the cultural properties that produce certain kinds of behaviors that are at work, and really we need to pop the hood and we will find some evolved mechanism. I really think 2 points here. First, why do we think that understanding the genetic basis of a particular kind of behavior is of utility to us? That's the first question. It's not clear to me that the ways in which we organize ourselves, the ways in which we live our lives will be augmented or shifted on account of understanding that this particular kind of behavior was under genetic selection. So I'm not quite sure what we gain there. But the second issue is, suppose we find that there are differences in behavioral repertoire amongst different kinds of people. Is that evidence that there's nothing going on that produced the behavior that is biological? No. clearly it doesn't say that the behavior being different across different people, that it isn't a biological, it's not produced by biology. What it's supposed to say from an evolutionary perspective is that the behavior itself is not under a particular modular genetic selection. I don't see any evidence that evolutionary psychologists could appeal to make that distinction, right? So here we have a group of people, they're separated from contemporary British folks, and they behave in a certain kind of way. It's a behavior that's quite entrenched in their community. It's wide across the population, but it's fairly novel to us. We've never seen it. Are we inclined, therefore, to say that this isn't a behavior that somehow should be understood in terms of biology, some way conceive? I prefer to say biology, some way conceive. Or are we inclined to say, well, it's clearly a product of culture because it's not widespread amongst us? It's not clear to me that there is anything that evolutionary psychologists could appeal to allow them to come to that kind of, come to some conclusion about those two kinds of cases.
I wonder actually if this might be a good moment to bring in my personal favourite subject, which is sex differences. Rather than going into different kinds of cultures, Simon, of course, I know that this touches on your work a lot. But, you know, one of the things that was said in the opening statement was the fact that, you know, the classical example is men don't raise children, right? They're not fathers. They spread their seed, they leave, and then the mothers do all the work. This is one of those classical evolutionary psychology type arguments that we've all heard, right? And yet now we see that men can do this, in fact. So then the question comes down to what you're saying, Subrena, which is, well, I guess people want to know, is there some kind of biological difference between males and females that maybe means that men are less good at doing parenthood? And there's both like ways of researching that, but of course your question is still valid of like, well, so what if there is?
So look, it could be the case that we behave in these disparate ways along gender lines on account of something biological. The question is whether that something biological is to be understood in terms of our ancestors having bequeathed to us a particular suite of genes that govern this way of being. So my position here is not that we should throw out biology. My position is that, first of all, I think the framework of evolution or not is problematic. Because there's one sense in which we could say everything about us can be understood in terms of evolution. But clearly that would be vacuous. Why? They're biological systems. And the fact that we do culture the way we do culture, it's precisely the fact that we are biological entities to begin with. But that's not what we mean. We mean to say, is there a way in which we could look at certain kinds of behaviors and see whether they are wholly the purview of biological evolutionary processes or the product of culture? Everybody knows that this dichotomy doesn't work and that we ought not to even appear to be suggesting that's the case. You know, I like to think in terms of the biological entities are involved in this co-construction. The resources are given from nature, if you like, and the resources are given from culture. And we make ourselves, to some extent, into the beings that we are. We can take on behavioral repertoire that become really, really entrenched, such that we're not able in any easy way to say whether it is a fact of our biology or it's a fact of our culture.
Simon, come on.
Okay. So thank you for the opportunity to bring gender into the discussion, sex and gender, okay. So, and maybe we'll also connect that to parenting. I've been looking at gender differences in empathy, and we published a paper just last year looking at whether women, on average, are better on tests of empathy than men. The two key words there are on average, because obviously these are just bell curves in the population that overlap significantly. What we found was across 57 different countries with 300,000 people taking an empathy test online, women on average scored better than men in the majority of those cultures. So connecting this to fathers, taking a role in childcare. You could try to construct some kind of just so evolutionary story, saying the reason that women, on average, have better empathy is because they had greater selection pressure being mothers for hundreds of thousands of years, maybe millions, to read their baby's mind. That part of infant survival is a caregiver being able to pick up on her infant's needs, for example, being thirsty, being in pain, and so forth. But clearly, fathers and men have this ability too. The fact that we've seen this very welcome cultural shift, so that my grandparents, the father played very little role in childcare. In my generation, fathers play hopefully an equal role in childcare. Just shows that culture is very malleable. We can decide whatever culture we want, and that both genders in this case have the ability to use empathy towards an infant just as to use empathy towards a friend or a stranger.
Well, I mean, Keith, I can see you nodding along, but then I think you also said this about sort of design to some extent. So let's say, all right, some of our behavior is biological, some of it is clearly shaped by culture. We can shape culture more mindfully. How do we do that? And is there a limit to how, I mean, I think this is what sits at the heart of this debate. Is there a limit to what culture can encourage us to change about our behavior? Or is there no limit to it?
This is a question about freedom, about whether we're constrained by our biology, by our genetics, and by our culture. Well, maybe this is a good point just to mention one of Dan's books here, which is called this, Freedom Evolves. Now, he thought we had a huge amount of freedom, a huge amount of autonomy, degrees of freedom that no other creature on this planet has. And he thought this was a product of evolution. One of evolution's strategy, evolution has many different strategies for getting creatures to survive and flourish. And one of them is to give them a lot of autonomy so that they can be really flexible, really adaptable. They can set their own goals. They can deal with that. Dan has a wonderful thought experiment about trying to preserve your body into the future, freeze your body and preserve it into the future. And in order to do this, you need to build a robot that could look after your frozen body for hundreds of years. And you'd have to give this robot so much autonomy, so much self-control to deal with all the changing circumstances that might happen over the next few hundreds of years, that, of course, it might then decide that it doesn't want to look after you anymore because you've given it so much freedom. It can stop doing the thing that it was designed to do. And in a way, our genes have done that with us. They've given us so much self-control that we can decide not to reproduce. We can decide to do all sorts of things that, from the genes' point of view, don't make any sense at all. But that was, if you like, the risk that the genes took. That one way of making a creature that will replicate well is to give it an awful lot of adaptability, an awful lot of flexibility. And so freedom, our freedom evolved. There's not an opposition between our being autonomous free agents and our being the products of evolution. It's because we're the products of evolution that we have this wonderful freedom. That's where it came from. It wasn't a divine gift. It was a hard-won product of billions of years of evolution.
Can I pick up? Yeah. Keith, I like your example of the freedom to choose not to reproduce, because many people choose not to have children, even though presumably the selection pressure is to have children. So there's the example of, if I can use the words in quotes, free will overriding evolutionary pressures to decide what kind of future do I want as an individual. I also wanted to come back to Subrena's point about what's the value of talking about an evolutionary or a biological element to human behavior. What benefit does it give us? And if we look at the example of language, I talked about language before because it's another human universal. These days we've got the genetic tools to look at the partly genetic contribution to language by doing genome-wide association studies. But we know that no human behavior is 100% genetic. So language is no different to other human behaviors in being partly genetic and partly the result of social factors. But understanding the genetic part may help us understand those children with disabilities specific to language development. There are children with language delay, for example, for partly genetic reasons. But when we look at language, we see biology and social factors interacting very beautifully. So, for example, girls on average talk earlier than boys. This is documented across different human cultures. That boys are overrepresented in clinics for language disorders. But you see the role of environment very clearly too, because firstborn children speak earlier than later-born children, presumably because firstborn children are getting more parental attention than later-born children who are struggling to get any attention at all.
I always knew I was better than my brother. This is what I've just taken away from this. Sorry, Simon. Fantastic. I mean, Subrena, what do you think?
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below.
With a free trial, you can enjoy the full talk and thousands more.
Thank you for being part of the conversation.